Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CivilNet podcast. I'm your host, Paul Vartan-Sukiasian, and today I'm joined by my colleague and political analyst, Eric Hacopian. Thanks for joining us, Eric.
It's a pleasure.
And I just wanted to remind you all that you can always support CivilNet to keep bringing you content like this over on our website. Just press the donate button. So now, Eric, Friday we saw a war of words in the Oval Office like none, I think, in White House history, where President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy kind of had it out. So what happened, and was it, like many are speculating, a setup?
It could have very well been a setup. Trump doesn't really plan anything, but given the outline of, I've never seen a meeting with the President of the United States in which the Vice President is there, the Secretary of State is there, the Defense Minister is there, and it's like this ongoing 50-minute long press conference even before the start of the meeting. You don't know if there was a meeting, there was a press conference supposed to be after the meeting. So it was quite confusing, and obviously this is... if it's a setup or not, we will never know. But it's very clear that this is something quite personal. And I think this is what's key for us, is to understand that people are trying to extrapolate what this means for the rest of the world. The actual conflict between the two men doesn't mean anything for the rest of the world because it's quite personal and it's quite specific to U.S.-Ukraine. The ancillary effects of it affect everybody else. But this, it's very clear that for Donald Trump, everything is personal. And he sees Volodymyr Zelenskyy as part of the plot of people that helped him be defeated in 2022 elections. And he thinks that they were part of all of these efforts, Russiagate and all of these things. And if you notice, one of the most noticeable parts is he actually goes on for 2 minutes about how him and Vladimir Putin were the victims of this Russiagate scandal, about how both of them had to put up with this. So he has very particular personal animus with Zelenskyy that has to do with his own interests and his own, what he sees Zelenskyy as being part of the plot against him in the 2020 elections and afterwards, and how he was vilified and all of these things that he claims. So I think we need to understand it in that context. How and why, we will never know, but this does not have to do with grand strategy. This has to do with the personal pet peeves of the most powerful man in the world who hates a very particular person. And if you go by extension, that J.D. Vance's and others, Ukraine and the cause for Ukraine has become a cognitive symbol of everything that the Trump world hates. Internationalism, NATO, the EU. So it's not about Ukraine itself. Ukraine has become a symbol of everything that they hate. And you pick it up on the just the tone of it that was going on and the fight. They've wanted this fight for a long time, and they got it. And frankly, Zelenskyy mishandled it. He was there to be humiliated, and in reality, he should have allowed himself to be humiliated, because if he would have been humiliated, they would have had a very limited room to act against him, i.e. stop weapon supplies and all of these other things. But what he did is he played into their game by acting like a man, which is gratifying at the moment, but is quite harmful to his country. With Trump, kissing up to him and, making him the center of attention will get you everything. Confronting him will get you nothing.
Yeah, and already President Trump has announced that he is canceling all aid to Ukraine, which maybe not a huge surprise. They were kind of bracing for that in the last days of the Biden administration. But a big question that we have, as Americans, we're in an interesting position where that is our country and we're seeing things going on there. But then we're in Armenia and we're Armenians. And so what does this mean for Armenians and small countries like ours?
I think, again, the Ukraine... people are trying to take too much of a read out of what this means. It doesn't mean anything for Armenia. What means something for Armenia and for many other countries is the fact that the international world order the United States has organized and led, the United States is no longer willing to organize and lead. And this is specifically having to do with international institutions. This is not to say the United States is not going to be involved in almost every corner of the world, but it's just going to be involved as a standalone, most powerful country in the world rather than part of networks, which the United States has always controlled, whether it's NATO, whether it's economic institutional networks. So that unraveling of the world and the certainties that it causes is far more relevant to the Armenians of the world, rather than the specifics of what's going on with Ukraine, which I think are very quite unique, because again, I think it's quite personal and has nothing to do with policy.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense, and it's not just small countries though that are still kind of concerned as to what's going on here, and we've seen a lot going on in Europe in the days since. So what's happening over there?
I think it's quite clear that the Europeans have gotten the message, and this is the two biggest things that likely came out of that Zelenskyy meeting. It was Europe understand. This was the sort of the November 9th, 2020 EU moment where they understood that they have no friends and they have no capacity to defend themselves unless they start doing it on their own. So this was like a worldwide November 9th. What we felt through, this is what the Europeans feel. Because the old systems and guarantees are not there, and people who you thought were your friends were actually your enemies. So it's very clear that the Europeans are going to, you hear it from the German chancellor on his election night speech. He says we need independence from the U.S. and we need to be able to act independently. So I think the understanding is there, which has never been there, which is quite remarkable. And this is the doing of the United States, this administration. Now, having said that and having the capacity to do it are completely different things. And the capacity is two things. Capacity is actually industrial military. And intelligence, because at this point, it's going to be very hard for the Europeans in short notice to make up for U.S. weapons shortfalls. But again, I think that doesn't mean Donald Trump won't be willing to sell them weapons, because that's business, and he would do that. So they could come up with the money. Europe has the capacity to defend itself. The issue is, do they have the political will to make the economic sacrifices necessary to do so, and to a great extent reindustrialize their base, specifically on a military front, to be able to do it. But that's not something that gets done overnight. That's going to take a long time. But, this is the single richest economic union in the world, and they have quite the capacity to do it and to turn around and create, quote unquote, a war economy at minimal expense to themselves. But the issue is the political leadership there? Is there anyone with gravitas in Europe? I don't see it. Are there multiple people that they can get together and do this, whether it's Macron or the new chancellor in Germany, or even someone as marginal as Keir Starmer? You don't see the characters, but do they have the capacity? And if people are forced into a corner, can they do it? Yes, they can. So this has actually created a situation in which Europe can actually finally stand up and become a world power as a collective. I'm talking about the EU and not just an economic one. It's really up to the current political leaders if they have the gravitas or the understanding to be able to pull it off.
And this brings us back to Armenia again, because it's been pushing for closer relations with the EU for the past years. That's been a center of the foreign policy. So what does this mean to us as Europe recalibrates? It's
actually very good. A Europe that is militarily stronger and more independent is actually a good thing for Armenia. There's also the secondary step to this is this European new rearmament is all going to come in many ways outside of the context of NATO. What you're seeing is NATO is going to become irrelevant over time as this administration essentially pulls back from its commitments. NATO is going to, because at the end of the day, NATO is Article 5 and all that. That doesn't mean anything. The only thing that matters in NATO is U.S. guarantees that if your country is invaded, the U.S. will respond. That is the NATO guarantee. It's not Article 5. And that no longer is there. So what you're going to have is you'll have the structure of NATO, because international structures never die. But it'll become less and less relevant over time as a substitute European alliance of some sort really takes its place. Now, why is that good for us? Is because stronger Europe is better for us. And secondly, there was no possible way that we would ever be part of NATO. We could never be part of NATO because of Turkish veto on a dozen different things, Russian veto, or whatever, however we're going to put it. We were never going to be part of NATO. But if there's a new European security structure, we can be part of it or be ancillary parts of it. So Europe standing up for itself and actually becoming a center of, or having the capacity or setting up new systems of alliances of defense are actually quite favorable to us.
That's it, because there were not going to be a Turkey in whatever this new European NATO replacement might be. And,
well, I think they'll be Turks they'll be viewed as too important and too big of an army to ignore. But it will not have a NATO. They will not be the leads, and they won't be the equal partners. Frankly, it'll be France, Germany, England. But bottom line is, it's a more open system for us than NATO is at this point.
I mean, it seems like Europe they're bracing themselves because, just a few days ago, the President Trump's close advisor, Elon Musk, who seems to have a real outsized role and influence over policy at this point, is already calling for the U.S. to withdraw from NATO.
Yeah.
And if that happened, that would just send shockwaves, I think. And yet we kind of saw it coming. Even the first Trump administration, there was all this rhetoric about, they don't pay their fair share and they're really, taking advantage of us. And it's always this kind of...
NATO is halfway to being dead, which is the most remarkable political development of our time. Now, this is what we have to understand is, this is what's remarkable about the new leadership. What the United States had on January 20th of this year was the greatest empire known to man. I'm talking about the systems of alliances, economic power, military projection. The United States, in many ways, still rule the world. It was an empire to an extent that Rome or the British Empire would even dream of. When you think about intelligence capacity, the capacity of having the most powerful nations in the world, the richest ones, serving your interests, they are systematically dismantling that. And because they think that they can keep all of their economic privileges, that they can still be an independent actor and still be very, very important or run the world. But it really doesn't work like that. The U.S. has a lot of privileges, especially economic privileges, whether it's the role of the dollar, whether it's people not going after social media monopolies, IT monopolies that the United States enjoys. That is predicated on the United States security guarantee. It's predicated on the United States being not only the most powerful country in the world, but being able to protect you or give you that guarantee of protection. What these people don't realize is the moment that is gone, the EU, that is actually a far more relevant, it's actually a more richer economic union than the United States, can force Facebook to break up. And U.S. control of social media is tremendously important because of all that means and intelligence and understanding of, whatever is going on in the world. What they have miscalculated, and they will find out over time, is, yes, you can do away with all of these institutions. You can do away with having these individual U.S. policies here and there. But the moment that security role, that the military role is gone, your other privileges, people will stop listening to you because you have nothing to offer them except threats or tariffs or half a dozen different things, or threats to invade Greenland or Panama. So this is one of the greatest miscalculations in history because they are dismantling the greatest empire in history without thinking through the consequences.
And well, I think that's what gets a lot of people because, Trump, for example, he says, I speak for American values. American values are me. Now, of course, that's arguable because what is in U.S. interests, for example, a lot of people have their own opinions about that. But, this is why a lot of people will then on the more conspiratorial side say he's a Russian agent, he's a this and a that. I mean, what is going on here? Is it just his own, his own idea of what American values are?
Okay. This is, again, I think the U.S. Political system now is a fight between two primary groups. It's the corporatists and the oligarchs. corporatists need systems, they need rules, they need empire. Oligarchs need chaos, individual rule, and no rules, and no rule of law. So what this is essentially the United States stepping back to becoming a gigantic version of Serge Sarkisian's Armenia with nuclear weapons. It's that kind of a setup in which the rule of law institutions are slowly, deliberately destroyed, and they're replaced with the individual whims of a few people. It's very hard for people to comprehend or understand, but this is what they want, is an oligarchic system. An oligarchic system does not need rules. It does not need systems. It does not need a bureaucracy to implement its will. I mean, if you listen to Steve Bannon, which used to be one of the most important Trump's advisors, Steve, he talked about dismantling the administrative state. Now, why would you want to dismantle the administrative state? What we, frankly, in Armenia would love to have is actually an administrative state. We're trying to build an administrative state. While they're trying to wreck it, the reason you want to wreck it is because if you're going to have an Elon Musk or this one-person rule or this chaos, you cannot have systems and you cannot have functional bureaucracies. So people have a hard time understanding how is this coming about? This does not serve state interests. Well, because it's not designed to serve state interests. It's designed to serve other interests.
Is there a knockoff effect? Well, the first thing this makes you think of is here, we are an aspiring democracy here in the South Caucasus, which none of our neighbors are, and it's always been, how can Armenia even stand alone against this? And then we just had a visit to DC by Prime Minister Pashinyan, who is talking about Armenian values and democracy right at the moment when that seems to be out the window with the U.S. So does this in its own way benefit, for example, Azerbaijan, which is a fellow now, oligarchic system, autocratic, or is it more individualized? If Armenia can help in some way, well, then you can be whatever you want.
It's all still, it's people who try to draw massive conclusions about, this is helpful to this. They're giving it too much thought. Everything the United States now is going to be very specific, country-to-country relationships. It's not going to be based on values. It's going to be based on what's transactional or what serves him politically. If, for example, Donald Trump's constituencies, the religious right constituencies, convince him that Armenia is important, then Armenia will be important. If they don't, then Armenia isn't, and we might as well be Kenya or half a dozen, or most of the world. So it's... People, this does not mean that the Trump people want to disengage from the world. They just want to disengage from responsibility for the world, why they get to dominate the world, there's a contradiction which they don't understand. But it doesn't mean, is it an ideal situation? No. Is it a catastrophe? We don't know enough. And this confusion confuses everybody. It confuses us. It confuses the bad actors. It confuses everyone. No one really knows what any of these things mean because there's no precedence for it. So for people to sit here and make absolute predictions, it doesn't mean anything like that. Because Trump is completely unpredictable. You might think that, okay, I have carte blanche to do something, and he can wake up one morning and do a tweet threatening to destroy your economy, as he has done countless times. So we don't know enough to know what all of this means. And let's just be honest here. The U.S. Political establishment or the foreign policy establishment that he's attacking and tearing apart has never been pro-Armenia. Mm-hmm. This is the same people that actually sat through and quite happily allowed 120,000 Armenians to be ethnically cleansed. So the issue is, what do you want? Do you want the hypocrisy and the tears of Samantha Powers or the gangsterism of this administration, which is quite honest? So, I mean, which one is it? One of the most interesting things is if you actually listen to the discourse between Vance, Trump, and Zelenskyy about you have no cards, you have no this, there's a corollary discourse to it, which I remember from what I knew about the backroom discussions with the State Department about Artsakh. They were saying the same thing. The bureaucracy in the State Department was, well, it's your fault. You should have made a deal when you could. These people have to deal with the consequences. You've lost the war. They were in fact gleeful about it.
Wow.
Like you had it coming. That's what you get for playing with the Russians. So you want us to shed tears that these people are being marginalized? I'm not going to shed tears other way. There's one of the things that people don't recognize is what's different about the Trump approach is the crudeness of it. The effect of it is the same, except these people don't want to or don't care to cover it up in a way. And they're far more honest about it.
People in America on the left had a real wake-up call, like, what just happened here? But that's it. People like the fact that he's, to them, a straight shooter, straight talker. You know where he's coming from. And maybe it's crude, but it's not covered in these layers of, democracy and freedom and all that, when really that's not what they stood for either.
I mean, okay, listen, like this whole thing about the rare earth minerals.
Yeah.
That it is how disgusting it is that he's demanding something material for people who are giving their lives to essentially serve Western interests in so many ways. But I'm sorry, if you go back in history, almost all the aid the United States gave in the Second World War, specifically to England, was what they took back in return was essentially the privileges of the British Empire. Britain essentially dismantled the empire and handed it over to the United States, in so many words. And this was done by a man who's lauded as one of the great statesmen of history, Franklin Roosevelt. This is about hard power politics. Is it pleasant? No. These people are very crude, but it is the same thing. There's this notion that this is some fantastically revolutionary moment. That's why people don't understand the level of continuity that's actually there. Nothing is really changed except the crudeness of it and the fact that they hate institutions and they think they can go on their own, which is a classic mistake. So this is not as different as people think it is. It's just it comes across as different because people had a set of illusions. And what Europeans found out is that they're Armenians.
Yeah.
That they are secondary, that they don't matter. And that people can bargain over your lives and your faith. And if you don't have hard power, it doesn't matter. It's like, what was it, when John McCain said, we're all Georgians today? All Europeans are Armenians now. So.
That is a framing I haven't heard, but it's a real adaptable. I mean, we really have to keep that in mind, and so do the Europeans. And one thing you brought up before was about, security guarantees, and that was a big issue during the Oval Office, fight. It was basically what it was. The cards. And Zelenskyy would respond, though, saying, well, Russia can't be trusted to keep a ceasefire. And that brought back for me memories of 2020, where we had 3 different ceasefires by 3 different countries. And each time it lasted a whole 1 minute until Azerbaijan just started shooting again. And so in that case, is there some naivety or an overly willingness to trust Russia? Or are they, the U.S. and the Trump team completely aware that you can't really trust Russia? And if Trump was no longer in office, then, hey, they might, the next day they might invade.
Well, guarantees, security guarantees are in the eye. It's a momentary thing. This president is here, this president's gone, this system changes, nothing is permanent. Is Zelenskyy correct about not trusting the Russians? Of course he's correct in not trusting the Russians. No one should trust the Russians. Is it likely that if a deal is made with every party involved that the Russia will violate it? Most likely not, because there's too many people watching and you made a deal with too many people. I think security guarantees are naive. It's really about forcing Russia to make peace with multiple countries that makes violating it much harder in the future. But if you look at this thing, this war is nowhere close to being done. It's very clear that this is a great attempt by Trump to sort of wash his hands in many ways of you wanted war, continue the war. But I don't see this war ending anytime soon. I'd be surprised if it does. And yes, what this is the greatest irony is, all of this has been about possible NATO membership in Ukrainian membership in NATO. And now NATO really doesn't exist. No one wants to acknowledge it. It doesn't matter if you join NATO. It's saying, I'm going to join CSTO. It's there.
Wow.
Or you want to join the Roman Empire. Yes, you can technically join. But what does it really do? So that's the great irony of all of this is, unfortunately, the one thing that's guaranteed is the Ukrainians get screwed at the end, no matter how this ends. Mm-hmm. There's really no scenario in which they don't. It's a question of how badly they get screwed.
Now, back to us a little bit. One thing that I noticed this during the talk, and some others on social media have pointed it out as well. Trump brought up during this meeting that he has secretly, at some point, I don't think he actually said when, but maybe stopped a war between two small countries no one has ever heard of. Now, some Armenians are jumping to the conclusion, this could be Armenia. He's talking about us. Now, that there's a lot of countries in the world. I'm not going to jump to that conclusion, but it does also bring up a bigger issue. What is, if you have any insight, happening behind the scenes right now, and how is Armenia struggling or to deal with this? And Pashinyan was just there. What happened?
I highly doubt. First of all, Trump is an actor. You can't. Everything he says is important, but not everything he says is relevant. This is the contradiction you have to understand. This could be true. It could be not true. It could be a complete exaggeration. If such a thing happened, it's highly unlikely for it to be about Armenia or Azerbaijan, because this would have happened in the last month, and there's been no indication of anything like that for him to prevent a war. So the likelihood of it having to do with us is not very high or zero, or he's simply making it up. If he's referring to his first term, obviously we had the war in his first term, so nothing was stopped. So he can't be referring to that. So I think people spend way too much time on trying to chase these things. That probably does not correspond with reality. Listen, the thing that people need to realize, that Washington, D.C. is an absolute chaos. To the extent that even White House staff were let go at the beginning of this administration. They're slowly coming back. The entire bureaucracy is under attack. So there is no U.S. policy with any significant portion of the world, maybe except Russia, Ukraine, and Israel or whatever. We're dealing with a completely chaotic situation. So I think what Armenia is doing is trying to find your way around it, find your way back doors, back rooms, in having relationships with Trump, with people around Trump. And this, a lot of the meetings and discourses that have happened, the meetings in Paris, whether it was Pashinyan going and meeting with the religious right leaders in the United States, all of this is essentially you're working around the chaos that's DC, waiting for some semblance of organization that will return, and it will return. And then for you to be in a good place to sort of engage in what you're doing. What you cannot do is draw too many massive conclusions about what any of this means, because there's no there at this point. A lot of the counterparts for foreign leaders to deal with don't exist. If you're a national security advisor in Armenia, your equivalent doesn't have staff to talk to you yet. So we have to understand we're dealing with this world of chaos, but then everyone is dealing with this world of chaos, which will eventually sort itself over the next few months. But what is clear is what's relevant with the United States is to have straight transactional relationships and transactional dealings on a one-on-one basis that serve U.S. interests. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. Top of the list, the nuclear plant in the United States, in Armenia. It's very likely to be a U.S. one. It's going to cost between $5 to $10 billion. And if you keep talking about it, you keep making that the centerpiece of it, that this is a great opportunity for the United States to export its nuclear technologies, new nuclear technologies at that, if it's the Westinghouse one. It is a tremendous opportunity. So you cannot sit and just be fearful of what this world means. No, you just have to, if these guys are transactional or their religious rights base is prioritizing Armenia, that's what you double down on. And you curse the Biden bureaucracy that allowed all these evil things to happen. It's really about being pragmatic and playing the game in the new format, which is, okay, don't come to me with nonsensical words about democracy and all that. What do you bring to the table to the United States? Well, what do we bring to you is $5 or $10 billion worth of nuclear business. What we bring to you is a new gold mine that is run by a U.S. company. What we bring to you is NVIDIA and Synopsys, two American firms doing chip design in Armenia, which is important to fight China. These are all things these are all real things. This is not conjecture. This is stuff that's on the table or it's already happening. So that's what this is all about. You can sit around and cry about the world order collapsing, but at the end of the day, that's what the American people voted for. So that's what you have to deal with. They voted for it for different reasons. You might agree with them or disagree with them, but that's none of our business.
The U.S. Embassy had a very, very excited sounding social media post regarding the Amulsar mine. The Armenian government has given it a loan to extend it, and they were like, Armenia is open for business. Yes. And they were clearly very happy about that.
It's mining for security. We're sort of ahead of the curve on this rare earth stuff.
It's a very, very good point.
So, it's not... for people who think it's the end of the world, we don't know enough that if it's the end of the world.
It could be, but
we don't know. It's any chaos like this also creates opportunities. And we always see the negative ledger for obvious reasons, but that's not how you approach things. You have to approach things as, what is it that we bring to the table? And I'm going to keep going back to this nuclear deal. A new nuclear plant, $5 to $10 billion, which, by the way, not at Armenia, not at U.S.-Russian relations are much better than EU-Russia relations. Russia has far less reason to object with us working with an American company, in a weird way. This whole thing actually creates opportunities. You just have to find your niche and go with it. A $5 to $10 billion nuclear plant is almost, 25% of our GDP, 25 to 30% of our entire GDP. That is a humongous investment. And Trump loves things like that. So that's what we have to focus on and move on.
It's a very, very good point. Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really enlightening, and I think we'll have more of these because there's going to be a lot more chaos to come, I can only imagine, and we need people like you to help us figure out what's going on and where Armenia is going. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us at the CivilNet podcast.